Listen, before you got here, your dad was bragging about how jacked you're getting, and he was like,
we went this morning. We went to the gym this morning.
He has shown me pictures of you, muscle pictures.
Stop doing that.
So I came across something interesting recently, and it made me think of your story. Phil Jackson, who is Michael Jordan's coach,
Yep, Chicago Bulls.
He has this idea that from the very same childhood trauma, we often get our brilliance and our dark side. So the same traumatic event in your life could produce like your genius and your sort of shadow person.
Sure.
You've been really open about from your own life. You grew up with an alcoholic dad who is very abusive, physically, verbally.
Yep.
Your mom just sort of shut down when he left, a lot of neglect. What do you think is your genius that came out of that trauma, and is there a dark side?
Yeah, I think Phil's right. I think, honestly, I don't know if I would call it genius, but I think to answer your question, it would be the benefit of growing up the way that I did is you're resilient. It really is a great testament to endurance. I think when you go through, I have one of these things that I say around here all the time. They're Mike-isms, and the whole church knows I do Mike-isms. But one of those Mike-isms now is that when you have gone through hard things, you can do hard things. And it really is a testament to the fact that you have to adapt when you're in a traumatic situation. Otherwise, you're re-traumatized over and over and over again. So your brain, your body, all parts of us learn to make something dysfunctional normal, so we're not re-traumatized. So when hard things happen to me, I just kind of brush them off. You know, I'm able to move through it. That's probably the superpower part of it. The downside of it is, because of that, I think I can mow over someone who's, weaker. I think it's easy for me to just be like, flip you, get out of the way, why don't you stronger? And the reality is the opposite of that is probably true too, that like if you haven't gone through really hard things, it may be very difficult for you to be resilient.
Interesting. I'm curious, what do you think your kids would say? Like, what would they say is your superpower in the dark side? Do you think they would all give the same answer that you're giving?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure what answer they would give. I don't think they've seen the dark side of that a lot, because I just have a deep and great affection for my family. And partly because my trauma was that, and maybe going back to the benefits of this, is that I treat my family just very differently than I was treated. So my kids know a totally different dad than my dad. My wife knows a totally different husband than my father was. So yeah, I don't know that they've seen a ton of the dark side of that. I can be impatient. I think that's definitely something. I want to go where I'm going, and I want you to go fast with me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because we're saying dark side in kind of a big way, but even if you took it more subtly, like we all have something in us probably that is a little bit, like your kids may not say, oh, this was super traumatic,
right?
But probably every parent has a little bit of like a dark side.
All of us are screwing up our kids in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question is, what is the way? Like, what would they say is, the way that...
Okay, I'm being ambushed. I couldn't figure out what was happening here for a second. I was like, Connor, why are you walking in right now?
Why do you think there's a third?
I don't know.
Did not even notice. He did not even notice.
I was come here. My beautiful granddaughter. Oh my gosh. I don't know if any of you can see this, but this is the most beautiful child in the entire world.
Do you want to take her out of there so
sweetie.
we can see her? I want to.
Okay, all right, here you go. I've got a microphone here. Gosh, she's so beautiful.
Oh my gosh.
She's sleeping.
So we have 3 generations of Adkins, like
we do.
right here.
Right here.
I was just asking your dad, Phil Jackson, who is Michael Jordan's coach, has this idea that from the same childhood trauma, we often get our genius and our dark side. And I was asking him what he thinks his genius is, and is there a dark side to it? And without knowing what he said, I'm curious what you would say about your dad.
On his behalf?
On his behalf, yeah.
What do you think the genius is, and what do you think the dark side of it is?
Oh, man. Rooted from childhood trauma?
Yeah.
I don't know. Man, you really threw me straight into it.
I know. I really did.
I don't know. I think you're... I feel like I very much care what people think about me. He does not at all. Did you just say that?
I did.
Did you say
I did. I said that's the dark side of it. The hard part of it is...
Yeah, and there's pros and cons to that.
There are.
Yeah.
There are pros and cons to that.
Yeah.
I'm not likely to be a people pleaser.
Right.
But Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, I think it's close enough. That's,
Yeah.
I think when you look at the best parts of that, I think it's what's part of what makes him a really good leader. That he is not trying to please everybody around him, but he can kind of have that tunnel vision towards where he's going. I do think though that I kind of like my people pleasing a little bit. I enjoy it.
Yeah. I love that.
I enjoy it. I like being liked by people.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think sometimes it can come off like brash if you're not careful, which I think he is. He's good at. He's good at being careful about it.
But that would be the dark side.
Yeah, that would be the dark
comes
side if I had to come up
You
with
hit
something.
it dead on, man. That's crazy.
Yeah.
It was pretty much what I said too.
Cool.
Like resiliency is what I thought the positive side of it was, like I can go through hard things. And then what you said.
Yeah.
It's good.
What would you say for yourself, Connor? Because you grew up very differently than your dad. You didn't have to have the same kind of trauma, abuse, alcoholism, all of that. But you obviously have a genius. You have everyone has a dark side. Both. What would you say for you? You kind of said people pleasing, but you don't even count that a dark side necessarily.
Yeah, no, I like it. I think it can
I love
cause.
that you said that. I'm like,
He
maybe
likes
I
his
should
dark
like
side.
mine
I
too.
have no dark side. I like everything about myself.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
great.
It's just I don't know. I think it allows me to be more aware, which is definitely a pro. But there's always going to be that like unnecessary stress that I feel like comes from being a people pleaser.
Yeah.
Which can be super frustrating sometimes for me. I don't know. It's hard sometimes to let the little things go and move on. And I'm an Enneagram 3. Okay. How familiar are you with the Enneagram?
I am familiar.
Decently?
I have a lot of 3 too.
Okay, yeah. That's where my people pleaser comes from. It's like the achiever personality.
Yes.
I want to be liked.
Same.
I want to be seen by other people, which I think is really fundamental in who I am. Whereas the challenger over here, it's interesting growing up with him because I think the 3 notably adapts to whoever
They're around. Yeah.
And so for the longest time I thought I was an 8. Because he was the person that I was like, I wanted
That's
to like
true,
me.
actually.
So it's like, there's
Yeah.
this weird, like, I always tell, because you can do like the wing and all that, and I'm not that into it, but I always tell people, like, I'm a 3 that was raised by an 8. So I think I can have some of those tendencies too of like, maybe on the bad side of it, when I feel that anxiety and that stress, instead of coming up with productive solutions, I can just be like, well, I don't actually give a crap what you think anyway, and like default to that, like, you don't matter to me anymore because you don't like me. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Yeah.
It's a self-protection, and that's what the Enneagram is, right? Like it's an adaptive way to not re-traumatize yourself over and over again.
I think what fascinates people about y'all's dynamic is that in one generation, you have turned things around so radically. I think a lot of people maybe make small steps, but it's like you and Connor have completely different stories. Talk to me about that. Like, how did you get there?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always kind of considered my life a transitional life, meaning like I think about my family. First of all, I think about family differently maybe than others do. I think about the past and I think about future generations. I'm not just thinking about me and my wife, right? I'm thinking about the generation that comes after and the generation that comes after. So to do that, I just see myself as moving from this incredibly dysfunctional family, which, by the way, was not just my father, it was generations of Adkins behind us, just the stories that have been passed down through our family. And I see myself as this transitional figure in our family so that I can stop and break those chains, which I think, number one, you have to be conscious of, generational curses, if you will, that are passed down through families. And I think sometimes when we hear the phrase generational curses, we think of we think about it wrongly. We think about it like a witchcraft. Like
voodoo-y,
voodoo-y. Like, I'm going to curse you and therefore it's going to go through your line. It's not like that. It's really about modeling. It's what you see that, you model, it's almost like imprinting. So when you watch your dad over and over and over deal with his stress by getting large and loud and physically violent, you just, as a child, go, well, this is the way of the world. Like, this is how you do things. It feels bad to me. I don't like it myself, but this must be what it's like to be a man. Just like if, you have a father who drinks too much. Every time he gets stressed, he may not be violent. He may be totally passive. In fact, he might actually be a better person when he is drunk. And so you look at that and you go, oh, that's how you deal with stress. You drink and you can fill in that blank with anything. And so as a child, you grow up modeling that or seeing that modeled for you. And as a result, it just becomes part of who you are. So I just took those chains and said, I'm not going to do that. I had a professor of psychology at Wheaton, and he told me, you're either going to be just like your dad or you're going to be reacting against your dad. And I made a choice in college to be like, I'm going to react against my dad. I'm going to be a different person.
Did you really never see like even a glimpse of that?
I mean, glimpses.
Yeah,
sure.
It feels to me almost impossible to think that you would never revert to what you saw modeled and then snap yourself out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let me clarify that. Like,
Yeah.
never in my life have I seen my dad drunk. So
Sure.
when I say a glimpse, it's not something like that. But I feel like nobody's going to do it perfectly. And when you're making such a drastic change in your life like that, there's always going to be moments where you feel weak and you go back to what you did before and what you've known growing up. And so, I don't know, I think here and there, when I like bombed a test or something like that, growing up, like...
Well, and I think and that's a hard thing for a transitional person to know the difference between appropriate discipline, where you have to go,
Yes.
stop being a jerk.
Right.
Be responsible.
Well, because you talk about reactionary, you don't want to be that other side where then it's just like, oh, anything goes.
Everything
Yeah.
goes. Right. Because that's not helpful either. Both of those things are equally harmful. So, I think, sure, I mean, did I lose my temper at times? 100%. But I think what my kids would say is that while dad's not perfect, we don't have the same experience as what he had growing up. And I think that's what a transitional period person is going to do. Like, I'm going to try to weed out as much. I'm going to make him healthier so that down the road, Jordan knows nothing of that kind of stuff.
Would you say we're all kind of transitional people? Like, my trauma growing was not nearly to the extent yours was, but is that the goal of every parent? We're all trying to do it a little bit better or break whatever we did see modeled?
No.
No?
I don't think most people are doing that at all, actually. I think what most people are doing is they're just trying to figure out how to make life work for themselves. And because they're concerned about life working for themselves and not what came before them and what came after them, what comes after them, I feel like they're just right in the here and now.
Just making it through
and
the
I
day.
would also disagree that you don't have trauma like I have trauma. Yours is different, but mine is just visibly obvious. But trauma is anything that would cause you to begin to dissociate, if you will, like adapt to chronic and terrible circumstances in challenging ways. So trauma is not what happens to you, it's your response to it. Okay? So in other words, somebody can come up and punch you in the face and you can respond adaptively and be like, that was a rude thing to do. And I have strength and I could punch you back, but I'm not going to. That's a way mature way of doing it. Or you just slam back somebody, right? Like, that's an adaptive way. You're choosing to adapt to this terrible thing that happened to you in certain ways. And really, it's the choices that we make reacting to trauma that actually cause us the problems.
So would you say everybody has trauma?
I would say everyone has their own version of trauma, possibly. Yeah. But I don't think and I don't live this way, but I don't walk around being like, I'm a survivor.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I actually think when you do that, you actually put yourself in some kind of like little box of dysfunction.
It becomes your identity.
It becomes your identity. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Did your dad have trauma, Mike?
Oh yeah. My dad was, my dad grew up really roughly. My grandfather, which I don't know a ton of this, I get this from my aunt, his aunt. And my grandfather died in the coal mines of West Virginia of a black lung, like almost all those guys did back then. They didn't have the equipment. Then my grandmother dropped my dad off at someone's house when he was like 7 and never came back. So he never saw her again. And then he went to Vietnam. So I think there are ways in which you could look at my father's story. I mean, he was a Marine recon guy, which is special forces for Marines, helicopter gunner behind enemy lines. He was shot. Again, all this from my aunt. I always wondered, he's got this big bullet hole thing here, right? And a scar that goes across his chest like this. So he had to pretend to be dead as the enemy came through and basically used their bayonets to rip people open. So they came back and got him. So yeah, he has huge traumas. Trauma that I look at and I go, how did you even make it through? But at the same time, I think, again, it's not the thing that happens to you. It's the response to what happens to you. Because there are plenty of men who've been through war and came back and were loving fathers and responsible citizens.
Where's that line, though? Like, where do you feel like you go from, like, okay, I am, like, a victim of something that's happened to me, and you want to take the appropriate amount of time to mourn that, to grieve that, but then you say, like, okay, I need to step out of this victim mentality and
It's a good
like
question.
choose my own way now.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of people who would look at your dad's story and be like, oh, well, you know, it kind of makes sense then why he was like that.
I agree.
Poor guy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So whereas I'm like, but at what point are you like, you can't keep pulling that back in?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you said it earlier. It's an identity issue. Everybody needs to grieve. Everybody. I mean, God gave us hearts to grieve. He calls us to grieve in the scriptures, mourn, grieve, wail, he says sometimes. So there are seasons for that. But I think when your season turns into your identity, that's the problem. And again, victim mentality leaves you defeated. I don't see myself as a victim. I see myself as somebody who overcame. Like, I'm changing my family.
It sounds like your dad, too, was not victim, and he just didn't even deal with it at all. Like, he didn't give any voice to it. And if you don't give any voice to it, like, you're exactly what you said. You're just making it through today.
Yes.
He's trying to do the best he can just to get through, not thinking about the legacy he's leaving.
I mean, Jeanne, I asked him numerous times, even right before he died. I was like, Dad, tell me about Vietnam. He said, it's the worst time of my life. I'm not going to talk about it. I think he came back and told my aunt, and then I think he never spoke about it ever again.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's not healthy. You know, when you take something and you leave it in darkness in your life, whether it's your own sin or someone else's sin or something traumatic that happens to them, I think when you leave it in darkness, it multiplies and it becomes worse. When you drag it into the light, it starts losing power right away. That's why confession is so important, by the way.
Connor, as you think about your dad, and I know you've talked about this from stage, Mike, like Adkins anger, that from the time they were young, you kind of told your kids, be aware of this, like this Adkins anger, which is like the generational sin you're talking about.
Yeah.
What does it mean to you, thinking about him as a granddaughter as a grandfather to your daughter, knowing all he's overcome, and how he's reframed all of that?
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I mean, I feel like, you know, whether it's like with raising her as she gets a little bit older, or like teaching. I do it in my teaching sometimes. I kind of have the best of both worlds. Like I kind of have like his like testimony and story to lean on and rely on while like I didn't live it. And so it's for me, it's interesting to like, you know, I'm glad I had kids so young. I'm glad that she's going to get plenty of time to really know him for who he is, because like that story is so important in our family. And I think like hearing it straight from the horse's mouth is a game changer. So I think it's awesome. I mean, sorry, but for me, it worked out pretty well in the sense that, yeah.
Well, let me push on that a little, though.
Yeah.
So, Mike, you were saying part of your superpower is resilience, which you said when you go through hard things, you're able to do hard things. Do you ever worry, or did you ever worry that some of that would be lost in raising a kid who has not had to live that same story? I mean, you have access to his stories, but it's obviously way different than developing the resilience of living through it.
Yeah.
But I think there's some things that we're doing even right now that help do that. You know, I mean, when Connor came to work for the church, you know, I told him, I'm like, this is an interesting story. I mean, I feel like we had a guy that was going through the program with Connor, and then Connor got the job, and he said, hey, how do I tell my friend? You know, and this guy's a good man. Like, we love him. He's a great guy. And he said, how do I tell my friend I got the job? And I told him, I said, you tell him you got the job because your dad's the pastor. You know, and then I said to Connor, I said, your responsibility in that is you have to be good at what you do, because everyone's going to look twice at you for whether or not you stay here because it's your dad. And I told him, you won't stay here if it's just because I'm your dad. So he's done such a great job of stepping up, and like I hear it from people in the church, I hear it from other staff members, you know, that he's just doing great. Resiliency can be built through trauma, but can also be built through discipline.
Yeah, and I think it's the choices that you make that really set you up for, because like every day if I woke up and asked myself, man, do I want to do hard things today that are going to build my character? No, not at all. But like when you make choices, when you have the chance to make a choice that's going to push you and stretch you in the long run, whether it's taking a job at Grace at 19 years old and pastoral care, or having a baby at 21, I feel like, all right, I'm in it. You know, like I'm going to wake up every day and take care of this baby because she's my baby. You can't say no more to that. And so I think when you're saying like that question of like the hard times create strong men, those things, for me, it's just like, okay, well, if you're fortunate enough to not have a testimony like my dad's, how can you make choices that kind of manufacture that resistance in your life? Because you need to know how to do hard things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you really think about it, obviously you don't have to have gone through alcoholism to develop. Like hardship comes for us. We don't have to even seek it out.
Right.
All of us are going to find it at some point.
Yeah.
So, Mike, you just said resilience can be built through discipline.
Yep.
Besides just trauma, unpack that for me a little.
Well, I would say honestly that resiliency is the way of God. I mean, you can't read the scriptures for long before you see God testing Israel or challenging, someone to make massive changes in their life. I mean, they went through a cycle in the Old Testament of hardship and wars and just terrible things. And I think we look at that and we think hard things are bad. And I look at that and I go, no, hard things are what make you great.
Amen.
In everything. I mean, whether you're a teacher in a public school, you have to endure the hardship of, political things or, even discipline issues, whatever it is that you're going through. It could be a surgeon. It could be anybody. But hard things are a blessing from the Lord because they make you harder. There's a thing out there on the internet. I will not get it right exactly, but I remember kind of the beginning and the end of it. It is essentially that hard times produce hard men, and soft times produce soft men. And I think you can make that choice, right? If you do hard things, you'll have a soft and better life. But if you do soft things, your life will be incredibly difficult.
Interesting. There's something there, though, Mike, that if I were saying what your superpower is, which I've heard your wife say, she thinks it's his, doesn't give a flip, he's going to go the way he's going to go, right? I don't know how I'd put this into words, but what you just said, I think that sometimes we make it really polar opposites. The narrative of a hard man who's lived through hard things and become a hard man, there is a lot of terrible men like that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, you look. I just was looking.
There's an unhealthy version of that.
There is. There's leaders who we could all think of probably pastors, but also just in the world of business, the guy who started the WWE.
Vince McMahon.
Yes. I mean, just hard.
I don't even know why I know that. I've never watched that kind of stuff ever.
Oh man, it's
amazing.
That's what he would be I'm a man, and it's just deplorable.
Yeah.
But then you don't want to go the other side of the soft. I mean, if you watch the documentary, it's deplorable. Okay. But here's the thing. I feel like you are a very enigmatic leader. You could have gone the way of other pastors who have been my way or the highway, and been what we would see the definition of almost toxic masculinity. But I think for you, there was an intersection of counseling and psychology that came in it at a moment that was your saving grace.
100%.
Because I think you're not hard, you're not soft. I don't even know what that word is. Do you know what I'm saying? But I think that's your superpower.
Yeah. I actually think that's wisdom is what I think that is. And I don't mean to say that I'm this wise person. I just mean to say that I think, when the Spirit of God is working on a heart, he is making that heart tough and gentle. And I think that's what the goal should be. We should be strong enough to endure everything God allows to come our way. But we should also be gentle enough to be able to respond to, the next generation. Or think about it as in King David.
Not like the real men don't cry kind of a thing. Yeah.
I mean, that's a terrible philosophy. David in the Old Testament was both a warrior, in fact, such a good warrior that God would not allow him to build the temple because he had shed too much blood. I mean, David was violent and hard.
Yeah.
But on the other side of that, he's writing poetry.
Yeah.
And he's writing these beautiful psalms where he pours his heart, mind, and life out to God. And they're incredible. So I think when the Spirit of the Lord is with a person, they become tougher and they become more gentle at the same time.
So if you were going to give kind of one piece of advice, and you can both chime in on this, let's pretend I am a parent who wants to break generational patterns that I've seen modeled. Where do I even start? That feels like I'm becoming aware, okay, I don't want to just make it through today, which I think was really, that hit me hard. I think because the needs of today are so constant, it's so easy to just get through the day. But I want to do better. Where do I start? What are some nuggets I can hold on to?
I think you start with yourself. I think one of the best things that they ever did for me was work on themselves, him and my mom. I think a lot of parents when they're with that like day to day, just got to get through it kind of thing, they have this like, well, I'm going to do what I have to do to fend for myself, and then I'm going to tell my kids what they should do. And it never works that way. No. Kids are always going to do what you do, not what you say. And I think when you take the time to build your character and work on yourself, like that, like I think for me, growing up in the faith, you see so many kids, pastors' kids who grew up in the church, who hit college, high school, and they're like, I'm done. And I think that could have been my story too, but I was like, this is legit. Like, he really means it. He doesn't just say it. So that made all of the difference for me in my experience.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think a big piece that I would tell a parent is you have to think about your life as a succession in your family. You know, that there are people who came before you that have created the story that you live now. And you have the potential of breaking and creating a brand new story for the next generation. And I think the reason why that doesn't happen is because it takes a pile of work.
It does.
It takes a pile of work of saying how I feel right now is dysfunctional and wrong. And no one wants to feel that way. They want to feel I'm a good person and everything's okay. But that just perpetuates this dysfunction, this generational curses throughout your family. To me, I think a lot of it has to do with the structure of your thinking. Like we were talking about the class that I teach on Tuesday nights here at Grace, and we're not talking about the content. Like, we do content at church. Here's what we should be thinking about. Like, here's the stories of God. We're going to give you the stories of God. We're going to let you, let those simmer in you, let the Spirit do His work inside of you. That's what we do at church. But in this class, we're doing something different. We're looking at the structure of the way we think, meaning it's not about what you're thinking, it's about how you're thinking. And so a lot of people have been given from our parents just things on the inside of them. We can call them core beliefs. And these core beliefs are things like, you know, I'm unlovable. And what happens is when you have something like, and there's thousands of these kind of core beliefs, right? And when something like that lodges deep inside your heart, your brain goes looking for information to reinforce the core belief. So if your core belief is I'm unlovable, then maybe when you get that great guy, that great girl, and you're feeling all the feels, and you're like, this is it. And then all of a sudden you start sabotaging it. You start messing it up. Why? Because something inside of you says, I'm going to hurt them before I get hurt because I'm unlovable. I know they're going to leave me. And that, I think, is just one example of how we've not just got to change what we believe, but we have to change the structure of the way we believe. And that takes a lot of work, and it's very emotionally draining.
Do you think people can do that on their own, or is that like everyone needs to be in counseling?
I don't know that everybody needs to be in counseling necessarily, because I think the degrees of generational sin that pass through families are different. You know, your thing might just be like, I just need to work on my temper a little bit, you know, and maybe trace back some of the, like, why do I have this temper? Is it just me being selfish? Is it just me is this what was modeled for me? Like, what's going on here? And so I don't think everybody needs to go through counseling. I think counseling's helpful. But I think you can do almost the same thing with somebody who's a wise Christian that has solved some of these problems for himself or herself. But being in relationship with somebody who's further down the road than you, that will always help. Because I didn't start with counseling. I started by modeling my life after this guy at church that I never spoke to ever. He was good looking. He dressed really well. His wife was super cute. He had these great kids.
Priorities.
And I was 18 years old, and I thought to myself, that guy
is who I want to be.
Yeah, that's the guy that I want to be. You know, and it really wasn't, but it's the guy that 18-year-old Mike needed to be, to find the guy that God would eventually turn me into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So being aware, I know you've talked about this before too, curating carefully the people in your inner circle is what you're kind of saying, so you can learn new modeling. Do you have any kind of tricks you've ever used, like in the heat of the moment? Let's say you're triggered, you want to be old Mike, or like the Mike that watched his dad lose his mind all the time, and like that snap you out of it right then and there to begin actively making a change?
Yeah, I mean, I think a piece of that for me has always been a phrase that I use again in my head all the time. When I feel myself rising, because it's there, it's not gone. I mean, it's not. Yeah, it's not. It's. I don't know.
You said temper. I was like,
yeah, I just don't know that it ever goes away permanently. I think what we can do is control it through the Holy Spirit and through our own work. But for me, it's respond, don't react. Respond, don't react.
Respond, don't react.
Yeah.
Hang on, I'm gonna grab this for you.
Sure. There we go.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
I love her little sounds though.
This is the real question. Are you the kind of parent who's got to wash it, or are you just going to stick it in her mouth?
I'll stick it in her mouth.
As I would too.
Yeah.
As good parents.
I'm sorry. We can cut that
It's
out
immunity.
if anybody's going to be offended.
It's immunity.
You do
We'll
have
just do a
water,
cut,
though,
it'll be in
too.
her
You
mouth.
have water.
Yeah, I should be
Okay,
right.
what were you saying? We all have it in us.
Yeah, I don't know that those some of those things that are on the inside. I always feel like there's a fire on the inside of me.
Yes.
I do. I don't know how to describe that other than to say that the Lord has a big hand over it, and He's controlling that. So my constant thing I say all the time is when I feel myself rising, Mike, you have to respond, not react, because reacting is when you get in trouble. When you respond, and I will ask more questions when I'm responding. What about this? What about this? What about this? Just to gain some clarity. And often what I find is, as I've asked more questions and I've invited more voices into the process, that I actually feel like it goes a better way than the way that I originally was upset it wasn't going. And so there's some truth to that.
He did it yesterday. I blew him off at the gym. I went home and I fell asleep and didn't go to the gym with him like I told him I was going to. And I came in and I was like, oh, I feel, and I didn't even really remember it until I walked in and I saw him. And that's the worst feeling in the world. I was like,
He didn't text him? Like, where he at?
He did, but I was asleep, so I didn't see it. And
So the discipline didn't quite trickle all the way down in the family.
I'm working on it.
Same answer. We're working on it.
It's the same answer because we're virtually the same person, except he's healthier.
Yeah.
and better looking. And I walked in and he was like, I could kind of see it on his face.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, how's it going? And he what you just said about responding and not reacting, he asked a question. He was like, hey, how's it going? And I was like, good. I feel so bad about missing the gym. And he said, you should, but I still love you. And it's just like, just like all that stress and that people pleasing in me. It was
I was just
like,
gonna say that's a moment you're people pleasing for the win.
Yes.
He wasn't like. I mean, if you put two of that together, it's not
a bad combo.
No, it's not a good combo.
Yeah, but the reaction or response there, as opposed to the reaction, was, I mean, it's a regular thing with him.
Yeah,
for sure.
Something I learned in counseling that I feel like gave me a lot of hope in parenting was the concept of like rupture and repair. Where a counselor told me rupture's inevitable, but what really counts is that you circle back to repair, because that's when you can go deeper. And I remember hearing Joshua Straub talk about he talked about, I'm not a baseball player, so I can't get this, but he was saying like batting averages, like in parenting, you only have to do it right. It was something like 40% of the time. It was less than 50%. And Clint and I were like, as far as emotional attunement and circling back to repair, they did this big study, and kids who were parented with like a strong sense of emotional safety grew up to have all these great benefits. And to get that, you only had to do it right about 40% of the time, which suddenly felt like it's not a one-off. It's like it's a whole story that your kid is seeing. Do you know what I mean? You could lose your temper a lot, but if you go back and repair and continually try, that's something. It's not nothing,
I think so, for sure.
I think that gave me, I'll be honest, Mike, when I hear your story, sometimes it feels a little like you just did it perfectly. And in my own life, it's like here I'm starting with less trauma, much less. And I can't just keep it together when, do you know what I mean? Over little things.
You are a terrible person.
I am a terrible person.
You're actually an amazing person.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes
you are
I go
just too hard on yourself.
But the stakes do feel high when you're raising little kids. And the worst thing ever, I don't know if you ever saw this in your kids, is when you see them do things that you're going, oh my goodness, that's me. Like they got that from me. And that's, it's exactly what you said, Connor. Do what I say, not what I do. That's a real tough pill to swallow, but.
It is.
Is there anything you ever think that you would do differently? Like when you say all of parenting is kind of a reaction to your parents.
Yeah.
Do you ever think like, even in the sense of being raised always in the spotlight, like you were a kid who, that's a difference in y'all's stories. You don't know what it's like to have a dad like you, who everybody knows and everybody wants a piece of.
Well, if my goal is to do that differently, I'm failing right now. I might put my daughter on a podcast before she's a year old, but
she's like, thanks, Dad. I just want to take a nap. I
just want to be a real person, Dad.
I'm so sleepy. You know, I don't think that is my goal. I think and every kid, and referring to my siblings, so different.
Yeah.
Because I think for me, you want to hold her?
Yeah.
All right, do it.
Like granddaddy hold her.
Do the viewers at home know it's 95 degrees in here?
Just gonna, when you said there's a fire in me, I was like, there's a fire.
Yeah, there's a fire around me, man.
Yeah,
it is so hot.
It's warm in here.
I'm happy to pass her off. She's a heater. Good luck with that.
Okay.
I don't know. I think all of me and my siblings would have a different answer to that question of
what they would do differently, or
what they would do differently, but also that like being in the spotlight thing. For me, that wasn't ever a huge deal. I'm a super extroverted people person, love it. So I don't know. I always liked that. I liked kind of the pressure, if that makes sense, because I do think there's pressure. Being a pastor's kid. All things considered, Grace has been a fantastic church to be a pastor's kid at. I've heard horror stories, and I'm fortunate enough to say I really don't have any. But I do think there's,
What do you mean you like the pressure?
Yeah. Like I was always raised, and this might partially be why I am a people pleaser when I think about it. But I was kind of raised with that, like, hey, people are watching. Like, you're the pastor's kid. Like, you're going to have extra eyes on you, so, like, don't be a fool this weekend at church, and don't do these things. And I think there is that pressure, but I think, going all the way back to what we were talking about before, it's built character, and it's allowed me to become who I am today. I like it. I've enjoyed it when I look back, and it never felt like a big weight on me either. I wouldn't say.
I think honestly that's because I think Connor is uniquely wired. He's a 3, and he's a fantastic leader though.
Yeah.
I mean, when Connor was this high, he'd be running around the church, and there'd be like 6 kids running after him, And so I think he's just kind of wired for the role, of pastor, in a way that maybe I had to develop into.
What's your best advice, Mike, for parents, young Connor in general, if you were kind of summing it up?
Yeah, be the same person that you are all the time. I mean, that's really it. One of the things that we see the most, and Connor mentioned it a little bit earlier, but the fastest way to get your kids not to love Jesus down the road is to be one way at home and another way at church. And the reality is you don't have to be perfect. We talked about that a second ago. And there are times when I had to go back, especially if I lost my temper or something, and I would not say, I'm sorry. I would ask for forgiveness. I need to ask your forgiveness. Will you forgive me for this thing? I sinned against you. And I think I remember the very first time I did that with Connor, I remember him bursting into tears, and I think it was in a positive way, it was right on by.
I was trying to be smooth. Keep going.
And, I think children are really, really open to parents not being perfect. But not being hypocritical, pretending to be one thing on the outside and another thing on the inside. That's devastating to a person. Because honestly, the Christian life is hard. It's not meant to be always easy. We talked about hard things are the way God changes us. But at the end of the day, I think the hardest thing is to be raised by someone who is outwardly religious and yet inwardly unchristian. That's a terrible, terrible way to grow up.
Super damaging. So if we're talking about just final takeaways, building a new legacy, we're saying it takes awareness, it takes curating your inner circle so that you have the right kind of modeling. It takes being willing to learn new things. Anything
ways
you would
of
add.
Thinking.
Changing
your ways of thinking, and grabbing onto new ways of thinking for sure. I just think being a person who has a desire to grow is always so helpful for your family as you just continue to become a different person throughout time. I mean, somebody told me once, I think we talked about this on a podcast once, Stephen, when I got married, this guy said, you'll be married to 5 different women and it'll be your wife, but she'll be at least 5 different women. And he was an old guy. And I was like, that's 100%. I've at least seen 4. You know, I know that's true. And she's probably seeing the same with me.
But how encouraging can that be?
100%
like,
it's encouraging.
Tell
a story about the guys who were like, when you get married, it's going to be terrible. The guys that we worked at with Disney.
You need new
and
friends,
your response to that.
No, these guys were not my friends. I worked at Disney with these. Before I worked at Grace, I worked as a server at Disney, their Fort Wilderness grounds, and everybody I worked with was just very frustrating to work with. And I was getting married at 19, which lots of people had lots of opinions about, especially the people that I worked with there. And I had guys who were just like, "You're gonna ruin your life if you get like to my face. You're gonna ruin your life if you get married. Like this is not the right choice. Like you should be saving money. You should figure out your career first. You should do this." Or people who said, "Oh yeah, like this is great. Get married, have a few kids, get custody of them, leave your wife, and move on." And you're just like, oh, who are you talking to right now? It was like ridiculous. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, okay, I think that one of the biggest things was people said, you're 19, 18 now. By the time you're 25, you'll be a completely different person. And I'm like, from 25 to 30, I should be a different person. Yeah, and from 30 to 35, I'll be a different person. Yep. And so if we can't do it now, then we shouldn't get married ever. It's not an age thing.
Yeah, my favorite thing was essentially like, you know, you said to the person, we will grow together.
Right.
You know, and I think that is such a wise and helpful way of thinking about it. I mean, at any age, you could be in your 50s and you can grow apart. You could grow apart in your 60s. Mm-hmm. It takes intentionality, and it takes constantly growing and becoming the person that God wants you to be. Because I don't think we stop growing or becoming until He brings us home.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's every single day of our life we're becoming something different.
Yeah.
You are not who you are.
You are who you're becoming.
You are who you are becoming.
Yeah.
I love it. Fantastic.
Yeah, I remember talking to you in the car. We were driving down Park Avenue, Winter Park, and you were like, I asked you, because I think that day I had this feeling, which is ridiculous to say out loud, because I'm 21. But at any age, at any time, people feel this way. I was just like, I feel like I'm kind of behind. And I remember asking my dad, like, how different do you feel like you are from the time you were 30? And I think I was kind of like grasping it like, how much time do I still have left to change? And he asked me, he responded to me, I'll never forget it. He was just like, there's nothing left of 30-year-old Mike. Gone. And that is so encouraging to me, because I'm just like, the idea that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I can be a completely different person, better person, hopefully, God willing. That's awesome to me. I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. Good stuff. Yeah. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Jordan, best,
awesome.
best baby guest we got.
I'm going to go outside. It's cooler out there.
Yeah. No kidding. We're in Orlando, Florida.
Yeah.
And
it's cooler
outside than it is inside the studio.
Awesome.
All right, Jordan, say bye-bye. She said bye.
Grace After Hours is a production of Grace Church in Orlando, Florida. Grace's mission is helping people take their next step toward Christ. Learn more at discovergrace.com. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with someone you know, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.